Hi there, I'm John McAdams, founder of the Big Game Hunting blog. In this video, I do a detailed analysis of the new 7mm precision rifle cartridge from Hornady and how it compares to the also very new 6.8 Western cartridge from Winchester and Browning. Now, especially since they're both relatively new cartridges and they seem to fit in a similar performance category, it's only natural that many hunters would be curious as to how these two cartridges stack up against each other. So that is what I do in this episode, where I investigate the 6.8 Western versus 7mm PRC debate in detail and provide some insight into which cartridge is better suited for common hunting situations, so you can make an informed decision on which one is best for your individual needs. Before we get started, make sure you are on my email list. To do that, click the link in the video description below, or go to huntingguns101.com and sign up there for my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. You'll get my free ebook when you do that, plus you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday. These are entertaining and informative emails about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they enjoy receiving those emails and how much they look forward to hearing from me every weekday. So make sure you're getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com or by clicking that link in the video description. Additionally, click that red subscribe button below the video if you are not already subscribed to make sure you get my future videos when I release them. Okay, let's get started talking about the 6.8 Western and the 7mm PRC, and we'll start with the history of these two new cartridges. To do that, we're going to go all the way back to 1925 and talk about the 270 Winchester, because that's where this whole story really begins. Now, designed basically by necking down a 30-06 case to use .277 caliber instead of .308 caliber bullets, the original 270 Winchester load shot a 130 grain bullet at approximately 3,140 feet per second. Now, originally released with the fantastic Winchester Model 54 rifle, the cartridge developed a well-deserved reputation for effectiveness on thin-skinned game over the years. Though not an immediate hit, the 270 did eventually develop a large and devoted following during the course of the 20th century, and that cartridge became linked to the Winchester brand. Now, as good as the 270 Winchester is, though, shooters in the 21st century started to lament the relatively few choices for high BC hunting bullets available in .277 caliber. Now, this is because the 270 Winchester and the more recently developed 270 Weatherby and 270 Winchester Short Magnum have a semi-spec rifling twist rate of 1 in 10 inches. This twist rate worked pretty well for bullets in the 130 to 150 grain weight range the cartridge was originally developed for. Those bullets work great for many hunting situations, but they don't offer the sort of extended range performance more and more hunters and shooters are looking for these days. Shooters and hunters have started to place a much higher emphasis on long, heavy, and more aerodynamic projectiles in recent years with the rise in popularity of long-range shooting. In response, the various ammunition manufacturers have worked to satisfy that demand with offerings using sleek, low-drag bullets. The Nosler Accubon Long Range, the Barnes LRX, and the Hornady ELDX, and the various Berger bullets are all great examples of extremely aerodynamic hunting projectiles that have really taken off in recent years. Unfortunately, those slower rifling twist rates used by the 270 Winchester hampered the development of long, heavy, low-drag bullets in .277 caliber. For example, there are several different hunting bullet options available in 6.5mm, 7mm, and 30 caliber with a G1 ballistic coefficient over .600, like the 143 grain ELDX and 6.5mm, .625 BC. The 168 grain VLD Hunting in 7mm, .618 BC, and the 210 grain Accubon Long Range in 30 caliber with a .661 BC. Comparable bullets in .277 caliber include the 145 grain ELDX, .536 BC, the 150 grain VLD Hunting, .518 BC, and the 150 grain Accubon Long Range, .591 BC. Yes, it is true that hunters using custom rifles with fast enough rifling twist rates can use some of the very heavy and extremely aerodynamic .277 caliber bullets available these days, like the 170 grain Berger Extreme Outer Limits, with a .662 G1BC. Unfortunately, those heavy bullets simply aren't an option for hunters who don't hand load and who use factory production rifles, though. Now, that situation changed in early 2020 when Nosler rolled out their new 27 Nosler cartridge. Designed from the start to use the new 277 caliber 165 grain Accubon long range bullet with a .620 BC, 27 Nosler rifles used a faster 1 8.5 inch rifling twist rate and took the performance of the 277 caliber to the next level by allowing the use of extremely high BC bullets in a .277 caliber cartridge. Now, the Nosler cartridges in general are excellent performers that fire bullets with higher ballistic coefficients at very fast velocities. However, they're still niche offerings and are primarily available in custom rifle builds, with a couple of exceptions. Even so, the development of the 27 Nosler and 165 grain Accubon long range set things in motion for subsequent developments in the future. Now, the next domino fell on 15 January 2021 when Browning and Winchester announced the release of the new 6.8 Western cartridge. Also known as the 6.8 Winchester Western, the announcement of the new round took some by surprise. Instead of just revamping an older cartridge to use heavier bullets, designers at Winchester and Browning decided from the very beginning to build a purpose-built cartridge that will handily outperform the old 270 Winchester and 270 WSM. Basically, they wanted a new 277 caliber cartridge that offered magnum performance with very high BC bullets that would also fit in a short-action rifle. Here's what Kyle Massanelli, Winchester's lead designer for the 6.8 Western, had to say about the new cartridge in an interview with Guns and Ammo. And I quote, "We wanted to get into the untapped potential of bullets above the 264 caliber. We only wanted bullets with G1BCs above .600, and our goal was to beat the 300 Winchester Magnum's 180 grain Accubon's energy delivery at 500 yards." End of quote. Now, that 300 Win Mag 180 grain Accubon load is a pretty solid offering that a lot of people use, and it's very effective. So being able to beat that load in terms of energy at extended range out of a smaller cartridge that will fit in a short action rifle, like they talked about doing with the 6.8 Western, that's a pretty tall order, and that's really saying something that they were able to eventually accomplish that. And spoiler alert, yes, they did end up doing that with the 6.8 Western. So to that end, the folks at Winchester and Browning borrowed a page from the playbook used in other successful cartridge releases like the 6.5 PRC. Sharing some of the physical characteristics of the 270 WSM and 6.5 PRC, the 6.8 Western has an overall length of 2.955 inches and uses a beltless case that's 2.02 inches long, 0.535 inches in diameter at the base, and has a 35-degree shoulder. Though the 270 WSM has an overall length of 2.86 inches and fits neatly into the traditional definition of a short-action cartridge, the 6.8 Western exceeds those standards by a hair with a maximum cartridge overall length of 2.955 inches. Even so, the 6.8 Western, like the 6.5 PRC, will still feed reliably from other short-action AICS pattern box magazines that are becoming pretty darn common with modern rifles. Now, in addition to lengthening the overall length of the 6.8 Western, designers at Winchester moved the cartridge shoulder back slightly and decreased the case length compared to the 270 WSM. This resulted in a little bit more space for the bullet outside the case while still fitting within that maximum cartridge overall length standard. This is also known as head height. Now, head height is the amount of space available for the bullet outside the case while staying within the SAMI specifications for the cartridge. Put simply, more head height facilitates the use of very long, aerodynamic bullets without requiring them to be seated so deeply into the case that they intrude into the powder column, or being seated far enough outside the case that they exceed the SAMI maximum length for the cartridge. In that same vein, those longer bullets also require a faster rifling twist for proper stabilization and flight. So for this reason, the folks at Browning and Winchester designed the 6.8 Western for use in rifles with a 1 7.5 inch or 1 8 inch rifling twist rate. 1 8 inches is SAMI standard. Now, the end result is a handy and short .277 caliber cartridge that delivers impressive ballistics that compare very favorably to some noted Magnum cartridges that are popular among hunters. For instance, the 6.8 Western can fire a 165 grain Accubon long-range bullet with a very high BC of .620 at 2,970 feet per second for about 3,226 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. When you crunch those numbers and compare them to other cartridges, the 6.8 Western load has a flatter trajectory, less wind deflection, a tiny bit more retained energy, and a little less recoil than a 168 grain Accubon long-range factory load for the 7mm Remington Magnum. And yes, like I mentioned earlier, the 6.8 Western also accomplished Kyle Massanelli's stated goal of delivering more energy at 500 yards than Nosler's 300 Win Mag 180 grain factory Accubon load. In fact, the 6.8 Western 165 grain Accubon long-range load actually surpasses that particular 300 Win Mag factory load in the energy department at around 300 yards and has a flatter trajectory and less wind deflection than that 300 Win Mag load at 500 yards. And, oh, by the way, the 6.8 Western does all of that while still fitting in a short-action rifle. Now let's switch gears a little and talk about that other new hot rod these days, the 7mm precision rifle cartridge from Hornady. To do that, we need to talk a little bit about the forerunners of the 7 PRC, the 6.5 and the 300 PRC. Now, the 6.5 PRC and 300 PRC were the first two members of the precision rifle cartridge family, and both hit the market around the same time a few years ago. Though they may not look related at first glance, both use the 375 Ruger as a parent case. First introduced back in 2007, the 375 Ruger was built to deliver the same sort of performance as the legendary 375 H&H Magnum. However, the 375 Ruger does so out of a standard length rifle action instead of requiring a longer Magnum length action like the 375 H&H. How is this possible? Well, the 375 Ruger has the same .532-inch casehead diameter as the 375 H&H, so they both use a standard Magnum bolt face. However, unlike the 375 H&H, the 375 Ruger is a beltless cartridge with minimal taper, so the actual body of the 375 Ruger case is larger in diameter than is the case with the 375 H&H. And like I said, too, it has a minimally tapered case in contrast to the 375 H&H, which has I wouldn't say it is a steeply tapering case, but it has a noticeably tapered case. That reduces the overall case capacity of the cartridge. The end result is the 375 Ruger actually has a tiny bit more case capacity than the 375 H&H, even though the 375 Ruger is shorter overall. So anyway, the 6.5 and 300 PRC both utilize modified 375 Ruger cases and have an overall design optimized for performance with long, high BC bullets. Both cartridges also incorporate some modern cartridge design features to improve their overall accuracy potential. As you might guess from their names, the 6.5 PRC is a short-action cartridge that shoots 6.5mm or .264 caliber projectiles, while the 300 PRC is a physically larger cartridge utilizing 30 caliber or .308-inch bullets and requires a longer Magnum length rifle action. Both cartridges were well received in the hunting and shooting communities, and many began clamoring for a 7mm PRC to fill the gap between the little 6.5 and the much larger 300 PRC. Now, those people got what they asked for when Hornady received formal SAMI certification for the 7mm PRC in 2022 and officially announced the new cartridge to the world later that year. Instead of attempting to push a bullet with a moderately high BC as fast as possible in a long-action rifle, Hornady designed the 7mm PRC to fire heavier bullets with an insanely high ballistic coefficient right at 3,000 feet per second. Plus, the 7mm PRC also utilizes many of the same modern cartridge design principles as the 6.5 Creedmoor, the 6.5 PRC, the 6.8 Western, and the 300 PRC. We'll discuss those details later, but let's just say right now the 7 PRC has ample head height for use with those long, high BC bullets that are becoming more and more popular these days. Plus, Rifles chambered in that cartridge also typically have a relatively fast rifling twist rate, usually around 1 1/8 inches, in order to stabilize those long, heavy, high BC bullets. They're also built with a long enough case neck to provide adequate neck tension with those long bullets. This can also help with accuracy. And they also typically have a relatively quote-unquote tight freebore diameter. Now, freebore is the smooth portion of the rifle barrel closest to the cartridge. Having a more snug freebore diameter means there's less room for the bullet to yaw upon firing before engaging the rifling. This can also help enhance accuracy. Long story short, the 7mm PRC is an efficient cartridge designed specifically to launch the heaviest and most aerodynamic 7mm bullets at magnum velocities, while at the same time providing a high degree of accuracy potential from off-the-shelf rifles using factory ammunition. Okay, now let's talk about the relative sizes of these two cartridges. First, since they are descended from completely different cartridges, the 6.8 Western has a slightly larger rim diameter than the 7mm PRC, 0.535 inches for the 6.8 Western versus 0.532 inches for the 7 PRC. But they both use a larger diameter beltless cartridge case and require a larger magnum bolt face. Additionally, the 7mm PRC has a 30-degree shoulder angle, while the 6.8 Western has an even steeper 35-degree shoulder angle. Next, the 7mm PRC has a slightly longer case length and overall length than the 6.8 Western. That's probably the single most important difference between the two cartridges. This is because that difference is significant enough that the 6.8 Western will work in a short-action rifle, while the 7mm PRC requires the use of a long or standard length action, same as the 30-06. Now that comes at the expense of powder capacity here, though, for the 6.8 Western. As you might expect, the 7mm PRC has a slightly larger case capacity and can hold about 7% more powder than the 6.8 Western. Now, the other big difference between the two cartridges is bullet diameter and bullet weight. So first, the 6.8 Western uses .277 caliber bullets, while the 7mm PRC uses slightly larger .284 caliber bullets. Most 6.8 Western factory loads shoot bullets in the 162 to 175 grain range. 162, 165, 170, 175 grain bullets are by far the most common for the cartridge. On the other hand, the 7mm PRC most often uses bullets in the 150 to 180 grain range, 160 grain bullets, 175, 180 grain bullets being the most common right now. In particular, it was specifically designed from the start to use high BC 160 grain monometal and 175 and 180 grain lead core bullets. We'll discuss the impacts of those differences in bullet diameter and bullet weight in more detail later. Now finally, they're both loaded to the same SAMI maximum average pressure of 65,000 psi. Now the differences in the external dimensions of these cartridges also translates into some interesting differences in their ballistic performance. And so I'll make these points by comparing some of the premier factory loads for each cartridge. So at this time, the 6.8 Western and the 7mm PRC are unfortunately not available in the same factory loads. This makes it difficult to do an exact apples-to-apples comparison. But comparing the popular factory loads at this instant will still provide some useful information on their performance afield. And instead of building castles in the sky about what it would be like to use this cartridge with this bullet that doesn't exist right now for it, we'll just compare what we got and we'll see how they stack up. So specifically, we'll compare 6.8 Western factory loads from the Winchester Expedition Big Game Long Range, Winchester Copper Impact, and Browning Long Range Pro lines with 165 grain Accubon Long Range, .620 BC, 162 grain Copper Impact, .564 BC, and 175 grain Sierra Game Changer, .617 BC bullets respectively. Likewise, the 7 PRC loads we'll talk about are from the Hornady Outfitter and Hornady Precision Hunter lines using 175 grain ELDX, .689 BC, and 160 grain CX with a .596 BC bullet. Now note that the CX and the Copper Impact are both lead-free monolithic projectiles designed by Hornady and Winchester respectively to deliver high weight retention and deep penetration. However, as a monolithic projectile, those bullets do not have nearly as high of a BC as the ELDX, Accubon Long Range, or Game Changer projectiles. Now, before going into the details of comparing the ballistics of these cartridges, I do want to point out that from the start, the various bullets used in those 7mm PRC loads all have a higher BC than those used in the comparable 6.8 Western loads. So specifically talking about the copper bullet to the other copper bullet, and then the lead core projectiles to the other lead core projectiles. So, first up, the 160 grain and 175 grain 7mm PRC loads are actually the flattest shooting loads of the bunch. Though that 165 grain Accubon long range for the 6.8 Western does track the 160 grain CX pretty closely, still has about a ½ inch more bullet drop than the CX load and nearly 2 inches more bullet drop than the 175 grain ELDX load at 500 yards. That really says something when a mono-metal bullet like a 160 grain CX is shooting flatter than the lead core projectiles in another high-performance cartridge. This is due to the fact that both 7mm PRC loads have a higher muzzle velocity than the 6.8 Western and also shoot very high BC bullets. Heck, the 7mm PRC is flinging a 175 grain bullet with an exceptionally high BC, 125 to 185 feet per second faster than the 6.8 Western shoots a 162 grain or 175 grain bullet. Now, that load even has a little bit higher BC and about 30 feet per second faster, more muzzle velocity over Winchester's flagship 165 grain Accubon long range loading for the 6.8 Western. Now, no shade on the 6.8 Western here. Even though the 7mm PRC does shoot a little bit flatter, all of these loadings that we're talking about here are relatively flat shooting, and just 5.8 inches separates the flattest shooting load from the most arcing load of these at 500 yards. Now, not surprisingly, the 7mm PRC also has more muzzle energy across the board than the 6.8 Western. Even so, the 6.8 Western does pretty well here, and all three loads for that cartridge carry over 1,600 foot-pounds of kinetic energy out past 500 yards, and over 1,800 foot-pounds of energy in the case of that 165 grain loading for it. Now, while the 165 Accubon long-range load for the 6.8 Western has a little more muzzle energy than the 160 grain CX load for the 7mm PRC, that 7mm PRC ELDX load has about 8 to 18% more muzzle energy than the various 6.8 Western loads. That 160 grain CX load for the 7mm PRC has about 13% more retained kinetic energy than the 162 grain copper impact load for the 6.8 Western, about 2% more retained kinetic energy than the 175 grain Sierra load, and about 3% less retained energy than the 165 grain Accubon long range load for the 6.8 Western at 500 yards. Now think about that for a second. The 165 grain and 175 grain loadings for the 6.8 Western are fantastic options, using two of the highest BC bullets available for that cartridge in a factory offering. But the 7mm PRC has a load using a much tougher mono-metal bullet that shoots a tiny bit flatter and has basically the same amount of retained energy at 500 yards. That sort of performance with a mono-metal bullet was basically unheard of until now. Additionally, that much higher BC 175 grain ELDX load for the 7PRC has 15 to 34% more retained energy than all 6.8 Western loads at 500 yards. So the big takeaways so far are that the 7mm PRC is the flattest shooting cartridge of the bunch, and that 175 grain load has the most retained energy at 500 yards. But the 6.8 Western still holds its own pretty well and is no slouch by any stretch of the imagination. Now, those trends continue as we look out to even longer ranges. Now, note that I'm not advocating using either cartridge for hunting at extreme range, but I just talk about this because that's when things start to get even more interesting as we increase the range. So once again, the 7mm PRC has the flattest trajectory of the bunch. Interestingly, the 175 grain ELDX loading for the 7mm PRC has 24 to 32% more kinetic energy remaining at 1,000 yards than the 165 and 175 grain loadings for the 6.8 Western. Once again, that's because that 175 grain ELDX has the highest BC of all the bullets used in this comparison, which allows it to retain energy and velocity better than everything else. Even that 160 grain CX loading for the 7mm PRC still carries over 1,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy out past 500 yards and over 1,000 foot-pounds of energy out past 900 yards. And it doesn't dip below its recommended minimum impact velocity until about 700 yards. And that's nearly as impressive as the performance of the 175 grain Sierra load, and is a substantial improvement over the 162 grain copper impact load for the 6.8 Western. Now let's talk about another extremely important factor, the wind. So we'll compare those same loads for each cartridge with a 10 mile an hour full value crosswind. When you do that, you'll see the same general trends hold true with regards to wind deflection. But that's where that 175 grain ELDX load for the 7mm PRC really starts to stand apart from the others. Now, the 7mm PRC ELDX has the least wind deflection, followed by the 6.8 Western 165 grain Accubon long range, then the 7mm PRC 160 grain CX, then the 6.8 Western 175 Sierra, then finally the 6.8 Western copper impact. While all of those loads, but to a lesser extent with the 162 grain copper impact, have excellent wind bucking characteristics, the 175 grain ELDX and the 165 grain Accubon long range and the 160 grain CX all have pretty similar wind deflection out to 500 yards. I'd go so far as to say that having less than 12 inches of wind deflection at 500 yards with a 10 mile an hour full value crosswind is absolutely outstanding. And that is exactly what you get from that 175 grain ELDX loading, and it delivers some of the best performance in windy conditions currently available for big game hunting ammo right now. So it's definitely the best, but that 160 grain CX and 165 grain Accubon long range, they don't fall quite below that 1 foot of wind deflection standard I just mentioned, but they're close, right at around 13 inches or just a little bit above it. So they're both excellent in this area as well. Now, while the 165 grain Accubon long range and 175 grain ELDX loads look pretty closely matched in this area at first, that 1.5 inches or 1.6 inches of difference in wind deflection between the ELDX and the Accubon long range at 500 yards might not sound like a tremendous amount, but that's still a 14% advantage in favor of the 7mm PRC. And of course, these differences become even more apparent at longer range too. For instance, the advantage the 175 grain ELDX load has over the 6.8 Western continues to grow as the range increases. And so this is an area where the 7PRC really shines with a combination of a high muzzle velocity and a very high BC bullet with that 175 grain ELDX. Indeed, it performs a lot better than most comparable loadings at extended range, and a hunter or a shooter looking for a little bit of an advantage in environmental conditions, especially with regards to the wind, would be well served to look at that 175 grain ELDX for the 7PRC here. Why is this the case? Now, assuming the same wind conditions, wind deflection is dependent on bullet velocity and BC. However, small changes in ballistic coefficient will result in bigger changes in wind deflection than is the case with velocity. So for this reason, that 7mm PRC load firing the super high BC 175 grain ELDX at a pretty fast velocity comes out on top here. Now, once again, the 6.8 Western, and especially with that 165 grain Accubon long range, still holds its own pretty well, and it delivers very good, even excellent performance in the wind. That's hands down the best load for the 6.8 Western on paper, and it also edges the 160 grain CX load for the 7mm PRC by a little bit. Now, external ballistics don't tell the whole story, though, and there's more to picking a hunting cartridge than just comparing kinetic energy, bullet drop, or wind deflection at various ranges. So the first thing we'll talk about outside of those things is recoil, which is another important factor. Now, when you compare the recoil produced by hand loads that are very similar to the 165 and 175 grain loads for the two cartridges from identical weight rifles, you get some interesting results. Now, both cartridges have fairly stout recoil, but it's not terrible, and that 7mm PRC load does have more recoil than the 6.8 Western with these particular loadings. Now, that 7mm PRC load fires a heavier bullet at a faster velocity, and it uses a little more powder to achieve that performance. The end result is that the 7mm PRC has about 11.6% more free recoil energy than the 6.8 Western. Now, the 7 PRC does not have terrible recoil itself. I would say that the recoil produced by that particular load is stout, but it's also not so excessive that it is impossible to shoot. For reference, my 7mm PRC has noticeably less recoil than the typical 300 Win Mag factory loads I shoot in that rifle too, even though my 300 Win Mag is heavier than my 7 PRC rifle. On the other hand, the 6.8 Western is just a lighter recoiling cartridge, period. Now, while the 6.8 Western does indeed have less recoil, I feel like both cartridges have the sort of recoil many people can handle without a lot of trouble. This is especially true if you're shooting a rifle that fits you well, has a good recoil pad, or maybe is even equipped with a muzzle brake or a suppressor, both of which will further reduce felt recoil. So with all that said, though, it is still worth mentioning that the 7 PRC does kick more than the 6.8 Western. Now, there's a couple of other factors that I think are worth discussing too. So first, the 7mm PRC uses larger diameter bullets than the 6.8 Western. Specifically, the larger diameter .284 caliber bullets used by that 7mm cartridge has about 5% more frontal surface area than the .277 caliber bullets used by the 6.8 Western. All other things being equal, a bigger bullet will make a bigger hole, cause more tissue damage, and result in more blood loss on a game animal. Now, that is a small advantage in favor of the 7mm PRC. 5% is nothing to sneer at, but it's also not a gigantic difference here either. But when it is combined with the fact that the 7mm PRC just carries more kinetic energy downrange, those larger diameter bullets can be more helpful when hunting big game. Not to say the 6.8 Western is a bad choice for hunting bigger game like elk and moose. I just think the 7mm PRC is a little better in this area due to the advantages it has with the larger diameter bullet and just having more kinetic energy. Now, additionally, as I mentioned earlier, many of those longer .284 caliber bullets the 7mm PRC uses have a higher ballistic coefficient than the most common bullets used by the 6.8 Western, especially when bullet weights are similar. For instance, .277 caliber, 165 grain Accubon long range, and 175 grain Sierra Game Changer bullets that are very common with the 6.8 Western have G1 BCs of .620 and .617 respectively. Now, those are great bullets with high BCs themselves, but they fall a little short of the .284 caliber 175 grain ELDX used by the 7mm PRC, which has a G1 BC of .689. Another example is that 160 grain CX. It has a G1 BC of .596, and that outclasses the .564 BC of the 162 grain Copper Impact. Now, while those differences are indeed small in favor of the 7mm PRC, they're still worth considering because those slightly more aerodynamic projectiles don't slow down as fast and they're more resistant to wind drift. On the other hand, the 6.8 Western has an edge in terms of bullet sectional density in some cases. Now, sectional density is a measure of the ratio of the diameter of a projectile to its mass. All other things being equal, a heavier projectile of a given caliber will be longer and therefore have a higher sectional density and consequently penetrate deeper than projectiles with a lower mass and lower sectional density. Now, 162 grain, 165 grain, 170 grain, and 175 grain .277 caliber bullets have sectional densities of .302, .307, .317, and .326 respectively. At the same time, 160 grain and 175 grain .284 caliber bullets have sectional densities of .283 and .310. So the 6.8 Western has a small edge over the 7mm PRC in terms of bullet sectional density, say when comparing their 162 grain Copper Impact to the 160 grain CX, as well as comparing the 170 grain PowerPoint and 175 grain Sierra to the 175 grain ELDX. However, that 7mm PRC 175 grain ELDX has a small edge over the 165 grain Accubon long range. To be fair, though, that 165 grain Accubon long range is generally a tougher bullet than the 175 grain ELDX because it has a bonded core, which the ELDX lacks. So all things being equal, even though it has a lower sectional density, I expect the 165 grain Accubon long range to penetrate a little deeper than the 175 grain ELDX and retain a little bit more weight because of those factors with regards to bullet construction I just talked about. Now, there's nothing wrong with the killing power or the penetration capabilities of the 7mm PRC, but I'll just say this is a potential advantage in favor of the 6.8 Western and could help the cartridge perform better on game than one might think about from just looking at the ballistics of the cartridge on paper. All right, what about accuracy of these cartridges? External ballistics are extremely important, but performance on paper doesn't mean a darn thing if you can't hit your target. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Winchester and Hornady both implemented some modern cartridge design principles with both of these cartridges to help optimize accuracy. Now, John Snow wrote a fantastic article on this subject for Outdoor Life. If you want to check it out, just do a Google search for John Snow Outdoor Life Modern Cartridge Design. You'll come up with this article, and you can read it in more detail for yourself. I'll summarize some of the things he says right now, though. Long story short, companies designing new cartridges these days typically employ some modern cartridge design principles that incorporate best practices obtained from competition and bench rest shooters to obtain the best possible accuracy. Cartridges designed using these principles use faster twist rates to stabilize heavy high BC bullets, have cases with a long enough neck to support those longer high BC bullets, can seat those long, high BC bullets to the SAMI specified maximum overall length without intruding into the powder column. They employ minimal body taper. They headspace off sharp shoulders and have a chamber design with a snug throat. When all those things are taken together, these design principles can result in a cartridge with a high degree of accuracy potential, especially at extended range. And like I mentioned earlier, both the 6.8 Western and the 7mm PRC incorporate all of those principles. So we'll drill down into things in a little bit more detail. So first, like I mentioned earlier, the throat is the smooth portion of a rifle barrel closest to the cartridge. Having a more snug throat diameter means there's less room for the bullet to yaw upon firing before engaging the rifling. This can help enhance accuracy. Well, the 7mm PRC and the 6.8 Western have throat diameters just 0.0006 inches and 0.0011 inches larger than their bullet diameter, respectively. Now, of those two cartridges, the 6.8 Western does have a little bit more quote-unquote slop in its chamber design than the 7 PRC, but I'll still say that it has a pretty snug throat diameter compared to older cartridges like the 243 Winchester, 0.0033 inches, the 264 Win Mag, 0.004 inches, or even the 308 Winchester, 0.002 inches. Additionally, both cartridges utilize a steeper shoulder for head spacing, 30 degrees for the 7 PRC, 35 degrees for the 6.8 Western. They have a faster SAMI spec rifling twist rate, 1 8 inches, and they have a long enough case neck that has ample head height to use those long, heavy, high BC bullets I keep talking about. So taken together, all of those factors result in excellent accuracy potential for both the 6.8 Western and the 7 PRC, especially with long, heavy, high BC bullets. Now, additionally, the 6.8 Western has an advantage here in that it is a short-action cartridge. In general, short-action cartridges sometimes have an advantage in terms of accuracy on an individual level due to their use with a shorter and stiffer bolt, as well as the fact that they also have a shorter and fatter powder column that can burn more consistently. So which one is better? It's really tough to say for certain because both are capable of excellent accuracy, and like I said, they both utilize all of those cartridge design principles that can enhance accuracy. On one hand, you could lean a little towards the 7mm PRC here. Details will vary on the exact rifle, ammo, and shooter in question, though. But on one hand, you could make the argument that the 7 PRC probably has some of the best potential for accuracy available today using factory rifles and ammunition. But on the other hand, the 6.8 Western has basically all the same advantages of the 7mm PRC, with the advantage of also being available in a short-action rifle. So let's just say that they're both excellent in terms of accuracy, and which one is best is probably going to come down to the specific rifle that you end up getting. But on average, both of them should be great, and both of them should probably be better than a lot of other comparable cartridges, especially older cartridges, in terms of accuracy on average with factory rifles and with factory ammunition. All right, so where do we stand overall with these two cartridges? So the 7mm PRC fires larger diameter, higher BC, and usually heavier bullets at a faster velocity than the 6.8 Western. For this reason, the 7mm PRC typically has more recoil, a flatter trajectory, more retained kinetic energy, and better resistance to wind deflection than is the case with the 6.8 Western. All right, let's talk about ammo availability for both cartridges. Now, both are very new, and ammo options for the 7 PRC and 6.8 Western are more limited than is the case with older and more established rounds like the 7 Rim Mag, for instance. And that's not to say that either is rare, but options are limited for both cartridges. Now, at this time, as I record this in 2023, Browning and Winchester are the primary sources of factory 6.8 Western ammo. Specifically, we got that Winchester Expedition Big Game Long Range load with the 165 grain Nosler Accubon Long Range, the Browning Long Range Pro Hunter line with the 175 grain Sierra Game Changer, the Winchester Ballistic Silvertip line with a 170 grain Ballistic Silvertip, the Winchester PowerPoint line with the 170 grain PowerPoint, and the Winchester Copper Impact line with a 162 grain Copper Impact bullet. Those are the only factory load options I'm available for the 6.8 Western right now. Now, released in 2021, right in the middle of that terrible 2020 to 2023 ammo shortage, the 6.8 Western has had, let's just say, uneven ammo availability over the past couple years. To the great frustration of many, the 165 grain Accubon long range load has been extremely difficult to find at times, and it has disappeared from retailers' shelves for months at a time. That was less of a problem with the Browning and especially the Copper Impact loadings, though, which have been much easier to find in general for 6.8 Western ammo. On the other hand, the 7mm PRC is literally brand new, but has become extremely popular in an astonishingly short amount of time. So at this instant, Hornady is the primary company that manufactures factory 7mm PRC ammo. They currently offer 3 factory loads for the cartridge, an offering in their match line with a 180 grain ELD match bullet, an offering in their outfitter line with a 160 grain CX bullet, and an offering in their precision hunter line with a 175 grain ELDX bullet. I think that match ammo is great for use at the range, but I think the outfitter and precision hunter 7 PRC loads are what you need to look at for hunting. Fortunately, both I think are excellent for hunting all manner of big game in North America and elsewhere in the world. Federal recently started making 7mm PRC ammo as well in their premium and terminal ascent lines using the 175 grain ELDX and the 155 grain terminal ascent. Remington also recently picked up the cartridge and now offers 7mm PRC factory ammo loaded with a 175 grain Spear Impact bullet. I'll also say that 7 PRC ammo prospects are looking very good in the near future, and there are rumblings that other companies might pick up the cartridge as well. Smaller, more quote-unquote boutique companies like Choice Ammunition make custom handloads for both cartridges, utilizing other bullets too. For instance, Choice Ammunition and Hendershots produce custom 7mm PRC ammo with a couple different bullet options from Barnes, Berger, Hammer, and Nosler. Likewise, Choice Ammunition produces 6.8 Western ammo with a couple different bullets from Berger and Nosler as well. Barnes also started producing a 155 grain LRX component bullet for the 6.8 Western too. All right, let's talk about rifle availability for both rounds. And I'll say that the situation with rifles is pretty similar to the ammo situation. Now, at this time, Browning and Winchester are the primary manufacturers of 6.8 Western rifles too. But we do have a pretty good selection of rifles in that chambering, though, from both companies. As I record this, we got 23 different versions of the Browning X-Bolt, 16 versions of the Winchester XPR, and 11 versions of the Winchester Model 70 available as bolt-action rifles in 6.8 Western. Winchester also just released a new version of their XPR Hunter True Timber Strata in 6.8 Western with a left-handed bolt in late 2023. And that is the first left-handed 6.8 Western rifle I'm aware of. Christensen Arms also just picked up the 6.8 Western in 2023 as well. And at this instant, they produce their Mesa FFT, Mesa FFT Titanium, Ridgeline FFT, and Ridgeline FFT Titanium models in 6.8 Western too. Seekins Precision and Fierce Firearms also started producing rifles in 6.8 Western in 2023 as well, and they currently offer the cartridge in a couple of different models too. Now, as far as the 7mm PRC goes, we got manufacturers like Browning, Christensen Arms, Fierce Firearms, GA Precision, Gunworks, Hill Country Rifles, Mossberg, Proof Research, Remington, Ruger, Savage Arms, Seekins Precision, Springfield Armory, they all produce rifles chambered in 7mm PRC. Christensen Arms also makes left-handed 7mm PRC rifles in their Ridgeline series. I actually have a Ridgeline FFT in 7mm PRC myself. So the 7mm PRC does have an edge in terms of rifle availability, and it seems like it's growing a little bit faster than the 6.8 Western. For the first year or so, maybe 2 years, nobody made 6.8 Western rifles except for Browning and Winchester. That is starting to change, like I said, with those other companies that have picked it up. But as you may have noticed, aside from Winchester repeating arms, all of the companies that make 6.8 Western rifles also make 7mm PRC rifles too. In terms of availability of rifles for each cartridge, it really depends. Availability for the 6.8 Western in particular has really fluctuated since its release. Because it was first released during the middle of the big ammo shortage in early 2021, really right in the middle of the worst of it, that meant that rifles in 6.8 Western were actually pretty easy to come by until the last couple of months of the year. In fact, I know of a couple instances where hunters who couldn't find ammo in their favorite cartridge during the terrible shortage in 2021, but they purchased rifles to 6.8 Western specifically because they were available and because they could get ammo for them. They bought a rifle so they could hunt with it that fall, and that worked out well. And I think a lot of those people were pretty happy with how it turned out, even though they may have been annoyed that they had to take that step in the first place. Fortunately, things have improved quite a bit as I record this in 2023, though. I wouldn't say that rifles in either cartridge are especially common, but neither is rare either. And of the two, I'd say the 7 PRC is probably the more common and easy to find rifles in right now. Now, before we move on to which cartridge I think is best suited for specific hunting situations, I have to answer this question. Will the 6.8 Western and the 7mm PRC last? Or are they just the latest flash in the pan and will disappear after a couple years? That's a tough question to answer. Nobody wants to buy a rifle chambered in a new cartridge only for the manufacturer to discontinue production of rifles and factory ammo just a couple years down the road. On one hand, I can understand why many people don't want to use something, especially something new that is uncommon. On the other hand, a lot of people have to start using that new cartridge for it to become common. So what does the future hold? My crystal ball is a bit murky, but I wouldn't be surprised if both cartridges stick around for many years. I would go with the 7 PRC if I had to pick the one most likely to have the best long-term success, though. It's really hard for me to bet against Hornady's design and marketing teams. Plus, the company also did an outstanding job of getting a large number of other manufacturers to pick up the cartridge right out of the gate, both in terms of rifles and ammunition. I'm not exaggerating when I say I've never seen anything explode in popularity quite like the 7mm PRC did. Now, while the 6.8 Western did not get off to as big of a roaring start, it seems to have really found a home in a particular segment of the hunting community. The fact that it outperforms the 7mm rim mag with a little less recoil and also fits in a short action rifle are also important advantages in its favor. Truth be told, I think the fact that the 6.8 Western is a true short action cartridge will be what saves it in the long run. But get back with me in 10 years and we'll see how accurate those predictions turn out to be. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about how each cartridge performs in a couple of different hunting situations. Do you primarily hunt medium-sized game like whitetail deer, feral hogs, or black bear at ranges within 200 yards? Both are extremely effective deer hunting cartridges and will absolutely get the job done on medium-sized game if you do your part. There really isn't a significant difference between the 6.8 Western and the 7 PRC on deer inside of 200 yards, and both are more than powerful enough for that sort of work. Are you looking for the cartridge better suited for long-range hunting for game like mule deer or pronghorn, antelope, and open country where you might need to take a shot at several hundred yards? Once again, both work really well in this role in situations like these or where they start to stand apart from other cartridges. The 7 PRC definitely carries more energy out to extended range than the others, but the 6.8 Western is also an excellent choice here that nips right on the heels of the 7mm PRC with quite a bit less recoil, and it also just fits in a smaller package. Do you want a hunting cartridge well suited for bigger game? Caribou, moose, elk, eland, kudu, red stag, that sort of thing.
Again, both will work extremely well when used on bigger game in North America, Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. Most hunters do not need the capabilities of the 6.8 Western or 7 PRC, and something like the 7 Rim Mag will work great for the majority of elk hunting situations. I personally don't feel comfortable shooting game out past about 450 yards myself, and several other popular hunting cartridges also perform great out that far and even farther in the right hands on really big game like elk and moose. However, a person with the right shooting skills who wanted to extend their effective range by another couple hundred yards would be well served by the 6.8 Western or especially the 7 PRC. The 7 PRC also just has better resistance to wind across the board. And since windy conditions tend to be pretty common out west, wind resistance for a cartridge should not be overlooked. I wouldn't blame someone for choosing the 6.8 Western, but I personally lean towards the 7mm PRC here, and I think it is a good choice for someone who wants a capable, all-around hunting rifle for everything from deer up to elk and moose. Now, while the 7mm PRC is unquestionably more powerful than the 6.8 Western, and it also uses larger diameter bullets, the 6.8 Western also still performs really well here, and it also recoils quite a bit less too. Plus, the smaller cartridge also just fits in a more compact short-action rifle. In fact, one could make the argument that the 6.8 Western is the most efficient and balanced short-action hunting cartridge available on the market today. So it's definitely worth considering for those who want a lighter rifle to take elk hunting in rougher country, and or among those who want magnum performance afield with a little bit less recoil. Now, in that vein, are you looking for a great cartridge for sheep, mountain goat, or tahr hunting where you need an effective cartridge with manageable recoil and a lightweight and easy to carry rifle? The 7mm PRC will certainly work, but I would prefer the 6.8 Western here because it's a short action cartridge and is available in shorter, lighter, and easier to carry rifles without terrible recoil. Sheep hunts are so unique and often so physically demanding that I would prioritize those attributes over a bigger and heavier rifle in 7mm PRC, even if that cartridge has a little bit better ballistics on paper. Now, that's not to say the 7 PRC is a bad choice for this sort of hunt. It's just a matter of what is better. And I think the 6.8 Western is a cartridge that really shines in this sort of role. Are you specifically hunting brown or grizzly bear? What if you hunt in Canada or Alaska and need a heavy-hitting cartridge just in case you find yourself on the wrong end of a brown or grizzly bear attack? I do not recommend either cartridge for actually hunting the big bears or other species of dangerous game like Cape buffalo, but they will work on the big bears in a pinch. Of the two, I would much prefer the 7mm PRC, but I definitely prefer to carry something heavier like a 338 Win Mag or a 375 H&H in grizzly country myself. Are you sensitive to recoil and in need of a lower recoiling cartridge? Both cartridges have fairly stout recoil, but the 6.8 Western is definitely the better choice of these two cartridges. Like I keep saying, the 6.8 Western is the perfect cartridge for someone who wants magnum performance with less recoil. Now, the 6.8 Western and the 7mm PRC are both excellent rifle cartridges. Now, while they are both much newer and more specialized rounds that offer certain advantages to hunters and shooters, few hunters really need the extra capability offered by the cartridges, and there's not a darn thing wrong with using something older and more established. Now, though the differences between them are fairly significant in certain respects, they're both suitable for many hunting tasks, ranging from hunting North American game to plains game in Africa to deer in the southern hemisphere. So I'm going to end with the advice that I always give at the end of these comparison episodes. One cartridge is not better than the other here in general across the board. Each cartridge is better suited for certain tasks, so you need to analyze your potential needs before making a decision. In the end, a lot of this decision comes down to personal preference, the exact game you're after, and the conditions of your hunt. So do that analysis, choose the one that you feel most comfortable with, and it will probably serve you well afield.
Okay, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now and hit that like button. Just click that thumbs up button below and the red subscribe button below the video to make sure you don't miss out on any of my other new videos about hunting gear reviews, cartridge comparisons, cartridge profiles, and more. Now, for more detailed information on popular hunting cartridges and what they are best suited for, click on the link in the description below or go to huntingguns101.com to get that free ebook on the best hunting cartridges I mentioned earlier. Now I'm going to turn it over to you. Which one do you prefer? The 6.8 Western or the 7mm PRC? What game have you successfully taken with them, and what ammo and rifle did you use in each case? Let me know by leaving a comment on this video right now. Also, feel free to leave a comment with requests for other cartridge comparisons you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and good hunting.